Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I'm really excited about my guest today. It's historian Pamela D. Toller, and she's the author of a book about an American journalist, Sigrid Schultz, who served as the Chicago Tribune's Berlin bureau chief and primary foreign correspondent in Central Europe from 1925 to January 1941. I think we'll find out why it ended in January 1941. Anyway, the book, The Dragon, The Dragon from Chicago, The Untold Story of American Reporter in Nazi Germany, is the latest of Pamela's 10 books of popular history for children and adults. So welcome, Pamela. I'm really excited to have you on the show. And let's just first, you fill in a sentence or two about 1925, and then I'm going to remind people, since I'm writing this book, and I went and checked my chapter, the Roaring Twenties weren't so roaring for Germany, to get a couple of dates straight. But in 1925, Mussolini had already been on the scene since October 30th, 1922. The Beer Hall Putsch took place in November 1923. I think that Hitler's trial was not only over, I think maybe he had gotten out after serving 5 months of his whatever short sentence.
Right.
So now, how does Sigrid get to Europe besides on a boat?
Well, Sigrid gets to Europe actually when she's 8 years old. She was born in Chicago. Her parents were immigrants here from Europe, and her father was a portrait painter. But the 1890s had a really bad economic depression. Portrait painters were finding trouble getting work, and he got a major commission to paint portraits of a pair of German royalty. So he took the family back to Europe for what he swore was only going to be 2 years. Turned it out to be 40 years before Sigrid lived in the United States again.
Wow.
Um, so she grows up, she goes to school in Germany, she goes to school in France. And then in right before World War I, her father sets up a new studio in Berlin. So they move from Paris to Berlin, and they get stuck there.
Mm.
Her First her mother and then her father are too ill to travel. So they can't get out. And Sigrid becomes the primary breadwinner for the family.
But they're not Jewish, right?
They're not, that's not clear. Actually, that is really not clear. There is a group of, I will say, amateur in the true sense of deeply passionate non-professionals. So it's a trio of amateur historians in Westport, Connecticut, which is where Sigrid lived the last years of her life, who make a really good case that she could have been Jewish. It's not conclusive, and Sigrid herself always said she wasn't whenever anyone asked, and occasionally would sort of say, "Isn't it funny? They even accused me of being Jewish." Under da, 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 da. But there are plenty of reasons why she would have claimed to not be
Yes,
Jewish,
absolutely.
in not only in Berlin under the Nazis, but also because her boss, Colonel McCormick, who was the publisher and owner of the Chicago Tribune, was definitely anti-Semitic. Not in a Nazi kind of way, but in that almost casual way that so many people of his class were at the time. And now and then he got nasty with it. So she had plenty of reasons to say she wasn't Jewish. So the answer here is we don't know, but maybe.
Okay, but it was interesting because you said got stuck in Germany in World War One. And so I didn't quite understand what you meant in terms of World War One, but her father wasn't drafted, right?
Her father wasn't drafted. He was not German. He was
Right, right.
Norwegian. And I mean, they get stuck there because her parents are too ill to travel. And then when America enters the war, they become enemy aliens.
Right.
So at that point, they can't travel. And in fact, they're not even supposed to travel outside this very clearly defined area around their house. And They have to go in every day, twice a day, to have their identity cards stamped to prove they're not traveling, which is a real nuisance when she's trying to earn a living in this sort of gig economy kind of way of putting together a lot of small jobs. And she basically bribes the police chief at the station with some of her father's good cigars so that she's not having to go every twice a day to get it stamped. She's very good at working the system.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I've read so far a good section of your book, and that became very clear that she was good at working the system. So then what happens? The war ends in 1918. Then what happens?
Um, she stumbles into becoming a journalist. World War One really changed the way American papers reported foreign news. Before the war, most American newspapers really thought that having an on-the-ground reporter in Europe was an expensive luxury, and they got their news from the wire services, which were much older than I realized going into this. But once the United States was in the war, then you've got hundreds of American journalists going to Europe to report. And at the end of the war, a lot of papers decided that their readers had clearly become interested in what was happening overseas. So they set up foreign news bureaus. Berlin is one of those. And the first bureau chief for the Chicago Tribune was a man named Dick Little. And Sigrid met him one night entirely, well, not entirely by accident, but she wasn't expecting it. They were at the same party and she had been invited as bait. The Her host, who was the older brother of one of her language students, one of the things she did during the war was teach
Language.
well-to-do Germans English and French. So the older brother of one of her language students was an important banker, and he and a lot of his friends wanted to meet these American journalists. So they sent them invitations to come to the party and they made the invitation a little sweeter with the promise that they would meet this young American woman who had been there through the war and could give them a firsthand account of wartime Berlin and the riots that led to the formation of the Weimar Republic. And two journalists accepted. One was Dick Little, and the other was his counterpart at the Chicago Daily News, who went on to become an important screenwriter, Ben Hecht.
Mm, Girl
Yes.
Friday, right?
Right, Girl Friday, just so we tie that loop.
Yes.
But so they're there. They come to the party. They're eager to meet her. She's excited about the idea of meeting people from Chicago, her hometown people. And they never get the story because as soon as they meet her, they're surrounded by a group of European guests who really want to talk to the Americans. But neither of the Americans speak German, and even the Germans who do speak English don't speak it well enough to have an intense conversation. And Sigrid volunteered to translate. So, she came to this party wanting to dance and eat food. It was the first big social event of
Yeah,
the post-war
right. After the
period. Right, we're talking 1919 now. And instead, she spends the whole night translating between English, French, and German, these really intense political and economic discussions. It literally lasted till dawn, and she loved it. A few days later, Dick Little had her translate a editorial for him from a German paper. And she took her time. She translated it really carefully. She'd stop and make sure he understood what some of the issues behind the words were. And he offered her then a job as a translator and cub reporter combined. She didn't even stop to ask how much it paid. She just, yes. It felt like she'd been designed for that job.
So now let's move up a little. I'm keeping my eye on that. To
Sure.
the, okay, so now she's bureau chief in 25. We can skip that part. They can read the book. And, when she takes over, what is it like? I mean, Mussolini's been in power for a couple of years. Hitler's on the rampage already.
Hitler's on the rampage, but he's not yet a major political force. In 1925, the Nazi Party only has 109,000 members, which in the context of Germany is a pretty small political party, and there are a bunch of political parties. And, the Weimar Republic is interesting. It's easy to forget how new it was.
Okay, can I clue in?
Sure.
Germany was ruled by a Kaiser until they lost the war, and then this Weimar Republic was set up. So,
Mhm.
and it really only spanned 20 years about. Yeah,
Right,
right. But because it's called the Weimar Republic, people not always don't always realize that it was Germany's democracy, and it was named after the town of Weimar's in Prussia or somewhere. Okay,
right. Okay. And like I said, so you're right, it's brand new. And Germans don't have a long history of democracy,
how about a short, non-existent
a
history?
short non-existent history of I mean, there had been a parliament, but it wasn't a parliament with any power. And the first generation of men who run it are Social Democrats, and they remain in power for most of the 20 years by putting together coalitions. Um, but by 1925, things are getting shaky. There's been some years of some really tough financial years, though it's at a relatively calm moment right then. But Hitler is coming to power more. There are people who are saying, gee, maybe we really need a Mussolini.
Hmm.
Wouldn't that be nice? But still, Hitler's only one of a number of people who are considered possible for that. Um, that all changes in 1929. That's really the tipping point. The America's crash takes Germany with it.
Stock market crash.
Stock market crash takes Germany with it, and it's just a bonanza for the Nazi Party. They go from 109,000 in 1925 to more than 1 million by 1932. And it's because the the economic disaster is so great. The party that's been there for so long doesn't seem to be able to fix it. Um, the new coalitions that come in toward the end don't seem to be able to fix it. And the German people had historically looked toward the left in times of economic difficulty, but now they start looking to the right. And Hitler's there with promises that he's going to make it better and also with scapegoats. I mean, he's got people he blames, as we all know.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, we know it started. Well, it started after the end of World War One with the stab in the back, but as I have in my in progress book, there was actually a memo in 1915 to a special circle in Germany about how we have to start getting blaming the Jews, and a Jewish
Absolutely.
newspaper reported it, but apparently it was ignored.
And, during World War One, Sigrid actually sits in on a meeting in which she hears a number of high-ranking German politicians talk about the fact that they are feeding money to Lenin in the Russian civil war that's going on. But if he isn't able to cause this second front that will ease the pressure on Germany, they're prepared to pull the funds and to flame the well-known anti-Semitism that is so powerful in Russia. So there are groups there that are willing to very calculatedly use what's really a very widespread anti-Semitism throughout Europe at that period for their own political uses. And Hitler steps in and uses something that's already there, but brings more viciousness and extraordinarily powerful rhetoric.
Although, I just read somewhere that he actually was trained. Not that he wasn't good, but he was actually at speaking, but he was literally in the early 20s picked to be trained, I don't know if with other people, to be that kind of
Oh, interesting.
bombastic. And I can't cite, but I just saw it in a reference and I thought, oh, well, that partly, not that he wouldn't have anyway, but
Right. I mean, I always tell people they can make you a better speaker, but they can't give you that
yes,
piece that makes it come
exactly.
alive, but they can give you all the tools
Exactly.
to do more with that. So, and Sigrid's there reporting on him every step of the way. She even has a private interview with him in 1931. And those are relatively rare. Over the course of his career, only about a dozen journalists had one-on-one interviews with him.
Do you mean foreign press journalist or?
Foreign press journalists, yeah. And that's a real eye opener when you read that article. And that's the one in which he famously is misquoted as saying, "My will be done." And that's not quite what he says, according to her, but it's close enough. But he makes it absolutely clear. He says, "I don't have to take over Germany by violence. I'm getting more power with every election." And that once we're in control, we're overthrowing this regime. I mean, it's just right there on the page.
I want to just repeat what you said. I understand he gave up violence after the beer hall putsch and said, I'm going to get, but once in power, we will overthrow the constitutionally elected government. And in fact, I earlier in these episodes have had Thomas Ryback, who's whatever the name of his book is, but his premise, it's not a premise, it's Hitler destroys the Constitution, using the Constitution in 53 days.
Absolutely. It is terrifying to watch how systematically he was able to disassemble what had really been a really politically creative, progressive government. And partially because there's no history of democracy in Germany, so you don't have, but there were existing institutions that had stood up against attempts to overthrow the Weimar Republic before, and he just dismantled everything.
Yes, all those political opponents,
All his political opponents, newspapers, trade unions, everything.
youth clubs, you had to be a member of their youth fine. I mean,
Right.
okay, which started in 1922, I just looked up, which is pretty amazing. So let's talk about Sigrid's reporting. What reports did she send back to the United States and were they published? Were they not published?
She reported on every major event of what we think of as the Nazi narrative, and a lot of important events that aren't part of the narrative as it's told to us, because unless you're deep in the weeds reading all the details, I mean, she was the only important Nazi event that she missed was the beer hall putsch because she was in the United States. After that, she reports on everything. And the astonishing thing to me is that it got published because Colonel McCormick disagreed with her on just about everything. I mean, he was anti Semitic, he was anti New Deal, he was anti Roosevelt, he didn't like the British much, he didn't like the East Coast much, period. And yet, her articles were consistently published. He did not censor her. Now, he did occasionally put them further back in the paper
I
than
was going
we
to ask you that.
they belonged. But you've got to remember that from our perspective, it is clearly the big story. At the time, it's less clear that it's the big story until really 1933. And even then, she's competing with,
Okay, we got to remind our public Hitler was
yes,
legally appointed, chosen chancellor, and he took over January 30th, 1933, and the rest is then he took control,
then he
dictatorial control
takes
within.
control, right. But even after 1933, for a long time, she's competing with stories that feel more important to Americans. But she is from 19, certainly from 31, and to a lesser extent earlier, she's consistently warning Americans that he is dangerous. She is consistently, and as he grows more powerful, she's saying, this is going to affect all of us. And she's right. I mean,
It's just
the first report she does of a concentration camp is in March 1933.
Dachau, right?
Yeah. And it's,
No,
and
I'm going
she,
to I just want to repeat it again. This is less than 2 months after Hitler took power.
right. And she uses this very clever technique to get stories out.
Oh yeah, wait. We have to talk
Sure.
about censorship. But okay, go ahead.
Well, it's sort of big because in some ways the Germans don't have a method in place to censor articles going out. They manage it with radio, but they never quite manage it with in a formal way with print journalism. But they sort of do after the fact censorship, where an article gets published and then someone complains about it, whether it's someone in Germany who sees it or a German in the United States who sees it. And so they're always censoring after the fact, which means if the trick is to get your article out so it doesn't catch that person's eye who's going to complain.
Interesting.
And she doesn't know. I mean, there are plenty of times where it's just a headline and it's a big headline, but that first concentration camp story, she uses a sandwich technique to get it out. So the beginning is this kind of interesting article about them searching Einstein's country home because they've had a warning that he's got weapons hidden in the house, that he's clearly stockpiling weapons for an uprising. And then which is just nonsense. And then there's this piece about the Dachau. And then it ends with her circling back to that story and saying where they didn't find anything sharper than a butter knife.
And I'd like to just tell people that Einstein, because I just researched this, was out of the country when Hitler was given power, and he never came back.
Right.
Okay, so just to
So
remind,
they're searching a house where he isn't even there. But that sandwich technique serves her well. She uses it over and over again because it takes advantage of the fact that lots of people don't read more than the first couple of paragraphs, so that anyone who's serious about the news is going to see it, but it makes it less likely that she'll get in trouble.
I'm laughing because in journalism school 1,000 years ago, we were taught the funnel system, right? Or the
Right.
most important. So it is a brilliant technique that she'll start with something that's not so whatever, and then get the important information. So what did you say about DACA?
It's just a factual thing. They've opened this concentration camp. They're sending prisoners there. I haven't been able to get in, but it's a factual statement that it has opened. She uses the words concentration camp.
Oh, that's
She's
interesting.
giving a a warning that something is going on here that we need to keep our eyes on.
Okay, and then what happens?
And there's nothing, she doesn't get called out on that. So she continues to report on everything, basically. She gets called into the Gestapo for the first time in June of 1933.
Oh, it took them that long. No, it's a joke.
Yeah, precisely. It took them that long. And it was kind of interesting because she gets a letter saying, could you come on this particular day at your convenience? So she goes and she sends Colonel McCormick a letter telling him about it. She goes to the American consulate and says, I want you, I'm not expecting any trouble, but this, and what she's really expecting is to get called out on the fact that she's done some really hard-hitting reporting on the enabling acts. And
Mm,
those were a series of laws that the Nazis pushed through the Reichstag that allowed Hitler to rule by decree. And it was because he didn't have enough people to rule without a consensus government. And so instead of getting a consensus, they just basically said parliament's irrelevant. And they had enough people to push that through. And she'd been reporting on it and what the consequences were. And so she was expecting to get called out on that. Instead, she got called in because someone had complained about an article that she'd written back in April. And it was about an unpleasant situation, certainly, that students in one of the universities, not in Berlin, but in surrounding areas, had been agitating to get some of their professors removed because they were Jewish. I mean, an important story, but not as big a story. And so that's what she was called in on. And she was basically given a warning about doing that kind of reporting. And she's like, it was in all your own papers. And they're like, we don't care. Um, and it was really the first time that she had this sense that being truthful and accurate wasn't going to be enough. I mean, she'd gotten called in by the Weimar press office pretty regularly when they didn't like something that she said about President von Hindenburg, for instance. But then she'd just say, well, was it accurate? And they go, well, yeah. Because you know, she had always used the truth and accuracy as her shield, and that just wasn't going to work anymore. And she got called in pretty regularly after that.
by the Gestapo,
Gestapo, yeah.
but they didn't arrest her.
But they didn't arrest her. Um,
But she had an American
partially
passport.
got an American passport, but some Americans did get arrested, though not for extensive periods of time. Some British reporters got arrested, though not for extensive periods of time. Um, Partially, I think it was just she was so visible,
Mm.
which we tend to forget. She was very visible.
Well, I think we need to explain, like, the only woman.
Not entirely the only woman, but one of the very few women who
And
was
when ranked that high, I mean,
in that,
having that high a
right,
position.
right. There the New York Times had a woman, but she was not, who of course I'm blanking totally on her name, um, who traveled though. She was a roving correspondent and chose the stories she wanted. Dorothy Thompson had been in Berlin for the Philadelphia Inquirer, but she had been gone for a long time at that point. She was back in town at one point, 36. And
We
she's
won't hold
actually
you to, we won't.
right, but in that general
Oh,
area.
36 might have been for the Summer Olympics.
No, she wasn't there for the Summer Olympics, but she came back with a visit and got kicked out.
Oh,
Um, but yeah, so the only one who's got that high, who's that prominent and is in place in Berlin is Sigrid Schultz.
so you
So
think in a way that protected her.
in some ways that protected her just because she was so visible and
And
she knew so many people.
wait, wasn't William Schreier kicked out in 33?
He was
Right.
not kicked out. And he was not there as long as she was. He was there for a period of time working for Hearst, and for a period of time where he worked for the Tribune. He was fired by the Tribune. He came back with CBS like the same day that Dorothy Thompson got kicked out. So it's
Oh,
35, 36, and he leaves before Sigrid does. So he's there for quite a bit shorter period of time than she does.
and so is there a Reason that she leaves in January 1941.
Yeah, I mean, she's basically by mid 1940, it's reached the point where she just didn't feel she could continue. She couldn't get stories out with any integrity.
Okay, wait, wait. Again, we have to go back to
Right.
September 1st, 1939. The war breaks out.
Hmm.
There's a non-aggression pact. So at this point in January 1941, the Germans have not attacked the Soviet Union yet, breaking the pact. That comes in June 1941. So, okay, so I've read somewhere, perhaps in Schuyler's book, I don't remember, that the Germans had their own press conference. Newspapers got reporters got to go to a press briefing daily that no one else was allowed in, and then the foreign correspondents got to go to separate press release.
Right. Yeah.
So they were being fed the party line.
They were being fed the party line. She didn't pay much attention to that anyway because she had still a very well established group of her own sources because she'd been in Berlin since 1914 and she spoke fluent German. So she knew people at all levels of German society. She had wonderful sources of her own. But with 39, in 1939, it begins to change because she doesn't have the ability to travel around the way she did. When the Germans do send foreign reporters on press junkets, they don't let her go, presumably because she's a woman, though also possibly because she had managed by then to piss them off so much. Um, so she finds ways around that. She hires a young man to go on the press junkets as her eyes and ears. She
Hmm.
she goes and hangs out in one of the Berlin train stations where the soldiers are heading east and is eavesdropping on German soldiers as they come and go, because which she can do because her German is so good. And that actually turns out to be her best source of war information is listening to the soldiers actually talk about what they're doing. But, it gets harder. She's basically reporting on the war when she can't get to the front. She's reporting on what's happening in Berlin. And her stories are getting stopped. I mean, they're not officially censored, but they are getting stopped. Her radio reports, because if we can circle back, starting with the Munich conference in 1938,
September 1938.
right, she ends up being a broadcast journalist as well as
Oh,
a
how
print
interesting.
journalist. And she has a Sunday night segment every week, 15 minutes. And there they do have censorship. The reporters, the radio reporters have to get there 2 hours before their slot to turn in their script, and it's got to get through three censors, one from the military, one from the press office, and one from the propaganda bureau. And so it's getting harder and harder to get those stories out. And in fact, there was one day when they mutilated her script so badly when it was on the invasion of Norway in
May, I think,
May,
1940.
April of
April or
19,
May. Yeah, Norway came
April,
first,
but it's
April.
1940,
And
and
then,
and
yeah,
they mutilated it so badly that she just refused to go in the air, and then rewrote it the next day to try and get her main point across. And in one of the statements that told me more about how she was feeling than almost anything was she wrote to her mother, who she had moved back to the United States several years previously for her to be safe, that, I'm writing so colorlessly about things that I care so much about that I am in sorrow. So it's getting harder and harder for her to report in 1940. It's getting more dangerous for her to report. Finally, at the end of the year, she writes to McCormick and says, I think I need to come home. I'm not doing any good here. I think I can actually give you better reporting on Germany from the United States at this point. He agrees. And it takes several months to be able to get out. because at that point, Germany is not only controlling who gets in, but who gets out. So she leaves in January of 41.
And just to remind my audience again, and Pearl Harbor is not until December of that year,
Right,
when then 3 days later, Hitler declares war on the United States. So she was still an American citizen in a country that was not at war w with Germany,
right.
but was very hampered in what she could report.
She was very hampered in what she could report. And, she went home. The plan was that she was going to stay just a few months and then she would be back and start reporting again from one of the neutral countries. And she caught typhus on the way back. She was very ill. She almost died. She got well enough to be able to go back, planning at that point to do war reporting because Pearl Harbor has happened. And then she got hit by a cab. And so there was more time. So it was 1945 before she was able to go back as a war correspondent.
So now, 1945 being the year that the war ended, which month are we talking about?
February.
So she went back in February, and where did she went back? Where did she go back to?
I mean, she flew into Paris. She was attached to an Army Air Force camp, press
Wait.
corps.
So Paris is liberated by this point.
Paris is liberated. There's a hotel that is serving as the hotel scribe, which is basically where almost all the accredited war correspondents stay when they're in Paris. She doesn't want to stay in Paris. She wants to get to the front. And she does. I mean, her most critical reporting is from the camps. She is part of a small group of war correspondents who are flown into Buchenwald only hours after it was liberated,
Which is in April of 1945.
April of 1945. And then she ends up reporting on several of the other, but her reporting from Buchenwald is just
Devastating.
devastating, just absolutely devastating. Um, And her experience of that is more personal than that of the other correspondents who were with her. And again, it's because of her language skills. She's able to talk to the men there in their own languages. And it is devastating. I mean, in that case, the Tribune had to cut her copy down to a third just because of paper restrictions. Because by that point there's paper
Right.
rationing
It
for the
was right.
papers. But I mean, they basically said it was the most shocking thing they had ever read.
And did they put it on the front page?
Yes,
And do you have, but does it exist from her papers, the original whole long article?
yes, you can read the whole long article.
Okay, and where can one read that?
That would be, it's in one of two places. Most of her personal papers are at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison, Wisconsin, and there are many, many, many of her articles in typewritten form available there. The other place, and I just don't remember which place it is in the McCormick Tribune archives, which is basically the Tribune archives from Colonel McCormick's days in office, and those are at Northwestern University.
So none of them are online, or they are online.
Her the papers aren't. The articles as published absolutely are online. And in fact, I read every bylined article she wrote from 1919 through a few that ran in the 1960s in chronological order online. Was a great way to do my research during the pandemic when all the archives were closed. Um,
Oh, that's really interesting. But all of this has been fascinating. And as I told Pamela before, I did trade as a journalist many years ago. And so I just find this, well, as soon as I saw the name of the book, American Reporter, Dane's Dragon from Chicago. I grew up outside Chicago in Elgin, Illinois. And I know I can still see the McCormick building. When we went to the dentist, that was the part of that I didn't tell you. Okay, that tall building on the river in Michigan Avenue. Uh, but I got all excited because a woman American reporter in Nazi Germany was just amazing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we have a couple minutes left. How did it get your attention?
It showed up in my newsfeed one day,
Really?
totally unexpected, because an architectural salvage vendor had paid to be able to take stuff out of an old house that was getting ready to be demolished in what's now Edgewater in Chicago. And he found 75 glass plate photographic negatives in the attic. And most of them were taken in and around the house, and they were of a young woman, a very small child, and a really big dog. And he went looking to find out who they were. And, Sigrid Schultz was the little girl. And, it was this interesting little story about historical research. But
Wait,
then
what year was
the
this?
punchline,
Wait, tell us what year this was when you saw this story.
2019.
Okay, so that's the reference to the pandemic. Okay, right, but before the
And
pandemic.
but the punchline was that she grew up to be a groundbreaking foreign correspondent for and possibly the first woman to be a bureau chief for a major American newspaper. And
And this was in that little article that you
that
read.
was in this little article. And I was like, what? And she never entirely vanished, so it didn't take me really a long time to get the big picture of her. But nobody had told her story in full. I mean, she walks across the stage in Eric Larson's The Garden of the Beasts a few times.
Uh,
Um,
okay, so I read that book 3 years ago. I remember that she was in, maybe not.
there's no particular reason you would, because she's not a big player. She's a very minor player. Um, but yeah, and I was hooked. I was just absolutely hooked. And the more I learned about her, the more hooked I became.
So all I can say is this has been a fabulous interview. And I hope that, okay, I'm going to put the link to your book. You get to choose whether it's your website or Amazon. And uh, in terms of the description, and I really, really encourage people, history of women, women journalism, blah, blah, for all different kinds of reasons to read this book because I think it's just an amazing story. And I
Well,
thank you so much for coming on.
thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it has